Hey everybody, Mark Thomas here. Welcome back. Let's talk some more Cobit. This time we're going to do another deep dive. We're going to do a deep dive into one of the management objectives, also known as a process, called BAI06. I'll tell you everything and more that you need to know to understand change control. We'll talk a little bit about some of our objectives. Our first objective for this course is to, number one, recognize the key terms and aspects of change management and how it benefits an organization. We'll recall the change management process and gain tips and tricks on how to adopt these in your organization. Today, finally, we'll talk about some key control objectives for change management and know where to find these in the Cobit framework. As you know, I'll do a dive into the Cobit framework so we can see where they come from. There's a lot of discussion these days on what an actual change is. I like to think of it as anything I'm sticking in, yanking out, or reaching my hand into a live environment and I'm twisting it. Anytime there's a modification, there has to be some type of change authority that approves that. And I think a lot of organizations may really have misunderstood this in the past because they said everything goes through a cab. So what are the types of changes we might encounter in this lineup of the types of changes? Well, we may have a standard change, a normal change, and an emergency change. These are pretty typical in our industry. A little deeper into each of these types. So let's start with the usage for these types of changes. So standard change, low risk, routine, repeatable types of modifications. This information right here you see on change types, you will have a download. Welcome back to Module 2. You know I'm a big fan of Cobit. I always want to see what Cobit says, and we're talking about BAI06, Managed IT Changes. What does Cobit say? Well, let's jump in. You might recall that Cobit has 40 governance and management objectives, and these objectives are broken up into management objectives on the right, governance objectives on the left. But the one we're focusing on today is this one called BAI6, Managed IT Changes. One of the things that Cobit will do for us is break this down into what we call practices. There are 4 key practices in the Cobit framework, and we'll look at this here in a second. Let's go take a look at BAI06, Managed IT Changes. All right, let's jump into the Cobit document that identifies and explains BAI06 Managed IT Changes. If you've been through a Cobit Foundation course, you probably have seen this before. But what we're going to do is break this down and take a look at some of the key things that Cobit says about how we're looking at change control. Let's move on to a knowledge check next. What we want to do is take the Cobit components on the left and match those with a short description that I put together on the right. As you know, you can pause this and think about it as we're walking through, but I'm going to start with the first called processes. And there you have it. Processes are an organized set of... Okay, one of the things that you noticed in Cobit is it does not give us a step-by-step guide. Other frameworks out there. So what do I think a general flow of this process called change management is? Number one, we need to record and initiate a change. Following that, somebody has to assess it. Once it's assessed, it gets authorized and scheduled. Following that, it gets implemented and that change is closed and reviewed. We're going to talk about those. So let's take each one of these steps that I think are important for us for change control, and let's walk through what those are. First, we're going to... So then we go into the assessment phase. I love this. Folks, here's how you assess changes. You do this with a combination of urgency and impact, and that's how we prioritize those changes. Well, urgency, that's a speed. That's how fast. There's examples here, urgent, high, medium, and low. Now, you're going to love this next part. What I want to do is take those 2 areas and I want to put them into a visual for me. So let me orient you to this 4x4 grid. So if you look on the left-hand side, we have the impact of the change. We saw this earlier. I have low, medium, high, and critical. And then on the bottom, we have urgency, low, medium, high, and critical. Remember, you can change these as you see fit what you're doing. Don't worry, I'll have a download of this grid for you because I know it's a lot of information for us to handle. But now we talked about those emergency changes. Where does that separate? An emergency change sits right up here. so we can schedule that. So let's talk about this thing called a change schedule, one of my favorite parts of change control. So we've authorized. So let's talk about this master change schedule. So if you pictured this is an example of the way my organization did it at my managed service provider. Remember, I'm doing hundreds, if not thousands of changes in a given week. We kept a rolling master calendar, as you see here, Monday through Friday with a Saturday and Sunday in there, okay? And I could look at this schedule days, weeks, or months in advance, and I could always look backwards and see what changes took place in the past. First, we may have to change those at some point, but you can see this change schedule can get complex. And it's, of course, I'm showing it to you on a PowerPoint file, but you should have a tool, for example, say ServiceNow, that can, with levels of authority. One of my favorite questions to always ask is, how do you know that the decision you are about to make is within your authority level? There's a lot of different authority levels, so take a look at these. Because remember, each type of change you're addressing has to have the proper level of authority. Because if you cannot meet the attributes that allow you to make that decision, this arrow right here on the right says you now have to escalate. Take a look here. What I've done on this grid is on the left-hand side, I use the level of management authority. Whether you're operational, tactical, or strategic. Operational meaning day-to-day work. Tactical, manager decisions. Strategic, more enterprise decisions. On the bottom, we have the technical domain or specific knowledge. Is this something you just need to understand? Is it something you relate to or something you apply? You'll see how this fills in here in a second. So if there may be some work that's operational and understand, hey, I can provide you an individual approval, right? Welcome back. Module 5 goes pretty quick, but I have a lot of information in here. What I've tried to do was take all these ideas in my head and put those into a list that I could give you so you don't run into some of the issues and problems that I have in the past. So here's some of my practical advice. My top 10 tips. Of course, I'm going to boil these down for you at the end of the course. But my first tip for you, number one, is delegate these levels. How do you measure this thing? There are a couple ways you can look at measuring change control. But what I want to really point out at first, before we start talking about measurements, let's look at something called a state flow diagram. If you look at this timeline, it all comes down to what is important to you and your interested parties. A couple ways we could look at these changes. We can look at them from outputs and outcome measurements. I've given you a lot of information in this course, and when I gave you some practical advice, we had a lot of tips. But I wanted to boil this down to really the top things that I think you should consider with change control. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I hope you got some good information about BAI06 managed changes. Keep an eye out. We're going to have more courses coming up. If there are one or more areas that you want me to focus on, hey, send me an email. I'll see if I can put that together for you. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or YouTube. But please take a chance to go out and do that course Q&A and test your knowledge on what you learned in this course. See you all next time.